Hey, this is four-time Black Belt World Champion Dominica Obelenite. If you guys are looking to level up your jiu-jitsu game with awesome jiu-jitsu courses on mindset, strategy, and beyond, make sure that you guys check out BJJ Mental Models Premium. I myself have a course up there, so make sure you guys check it out. Let's get you guys on that next step in your jiu-jitsu journey.
Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 226. I'm Steve Kwan. BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent jiu-jitsu approach. And today, I'm back with not one, but two of my favorite guests. I got Mr. Stephan Kesting and Mr. Rob Biernacki. How's it going, guys?
Oh, very well. It's always a huge pleasure to be here, Steve. So thank you so much for having me, and I'll let Rob thank you for having him.
He's not going to do that.
I will absolutely not thank you for anything.
Hey, speaking of which, this is a back-to-back with Rob. He was just on our prior episode.
Oh, sweet Jesus. I'm so sorry for your listeners.
Very different theme for the instructional this time around. This time we're talking about leg locks. But Rob, how was that last instructional selling? Is that working out okay for you?
Man, it is amazing how many people want to fleece the alpha community out there. I think I'm going to retire on the back of that one.
As we established in that episode, it is your moral duty to do this, right? I mean, who doesn't feel better when you fleece some alpha idiot, right? It's a feel-good thing that everyone should be a part of.
Rob, I've got an idea for you. You know, you could take it, you could use it, you could ignore it, but when you have your millions from it, you should flee to Romania.
And then intentionally own yourself on social media somehow. I mean, that's part of the prophecy, right? So we'll see how that goes. But hey, Rob, I'm glad I got you back on the podcast one more time before you wind up in a Romanian prison somewhere. So this is going to be a fun one. This one's an actual jiu-jitsu podcast. And I think everyone knows when you got Stephan and Rob on the same show, it's time to sell some instructionals. So guys, tell me all about it. Tell me what's up.
Well, actual jiu-jitsu and actual instructionals. Yeah, we're going back to the well. We're doing another leg lock instructional.
So hold on, you discovered more leg locks since the last one?
I mean, discovered, invented, stole, whatever. They're in the instructional either way.
It's really quite amazing how much the game has evolved in the last 4 or 5 years. And Rob and I were talking about this, and to some extent, we have to thank the IBJJF for this, for opening up, most of the leg lock game at black belt level and brown belt and black belt level. It's just allowed that many more people to focus on this area. And when you have more people looking at something and more people exploring it, you're going to find more, there's going to be more creative juices flowing, and you're going to find more answers, and you're going to find more tactics and more strategies and more techniques and more transitions and more counters. So it's really the continued popularity of no-gi competition, but it's also that whole other slew of competitors coming from the IBJJF background.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, is that, let's say, the first, I shouldn't say the first, but the most recent revolution or evolution in leg locking, which probably happened about, we're probably looking at like 7-8 years ago now, with Eddie Cummings and the guys out of the Blue Basement. They were, let's face it, it was a small number of people that had a huge advantage over everybody else based on some proprietary information. But there weren't that many, cooks in the kitchen there. It's not like there were a lot of people competing in rule sets that allowed heel hooks. And so like the amount of development that happened in that first little bit was very impressive, but it was still confined to certain pockets. People who were doing EBI, even people who were doing ADCC weren't as oriented towards it because ADCC is so wrestling heavy. So yeah, I think Stephan, you made a really good point, is that there's this enormous population of practitioners that were just frankly not putting their heads together in this realm, on this problem, creating solutions. And now that the IBJJF has allowed it, you either have to be very proficient at the attacks or very proficient at the defenses, or both, if you want to be successful. You can't just not know the stuff. So having so many more people who have spent so much time researching, refining, and then competing, and researching and refining again, and then competing, has led to just an explosion in the different types of solutions. There's very much we get into this in the instructional. There was a sort of an accepted, I don't want to call it a dogma, but an accepted methodology of how you wanted to control and attack the legs. And that's been turned on its head, although it still is very valid, but there's the completely opposite pathway. There are completely new control schemes, all kinds of different methods of attacking, stuff that is, genuinely, I think, quite new. I'm sure there's some Japanese guy, 1800 years ago, there's a cave painting of somebody doing a Zedlock, but as far as we know, it's a pretty recent invention. I had certainly never seen anything like it prior to a couple of years ago.
Yeah, it's interesting how quickly things have moved. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that you two made the modern leglock formula, and you probably didn't expect that this soon you were going to have to update it because what was modern had changed that quickly. It is interesting to see the rapid explosion of jiu-jitsu, and I am going to put my vote down for this new instructional being called the Postmodern Leglock formula. But Stephan, from what I understand, you don't think that name's going to sell, which makes me sad.
I actually did seriously consider it initially before you came up with it, Steve.
Well, it's the obvious name, so I'm not taking credit for this one.
It would have been hilarious. Now, in retrospect, when we did the modern leglock formula, Rob somehow wanted to insert an I in there so that we ended up with the abbreviation MILF for the instructional. And I put my foot down, and I actually regret doing that now. So, Rob, you win. It's a belated victory. So we're following up the MILF instructional with the postmodern leglock instructional.
Well, if I can throw my hat in the ring again, we should find a way to make the new acronym be GILF. If anyone doesn't know what that stands for, just Google it.
Go look it up.
Or alternately, don't Google it. Just don't do it. Anyway, back to leglocks. Okay, so tell me a bit about this. I mean, I took a pretty long hiatus for a while, even before the pandemic. When my kid was born, I was off jiu-jitsu for about a year and a half, and I missed a lot of the popularization of leglocks. And I remember coming back and seeing all of these new guys just tune me up for a while because I had no defenses against this stuff, and it took a while for me to build up something there. But again, the game has evolved quite a bit since then, and you did mention, Rob, that a big part of this is the branching off from just the leglock system, the idea being the Cummings-Danaher system that kind of made things so popular, and this realization that there are other pathways to this game. So maybe explain that a little bit. Tell me a little about how the new postmodern leglock formula differs from the, I guess you can call it the classic leglock formula, which is kind of funny to say because it's only a few years old. But what do you see the differences as being?
Well, so we're trying to once again do a fairly deep dive or an overview of what are the positions that are currently being played. We are updating the classic position. So the instructional starts out, as all of our work does, with some conceptual stuff, an overall recapitulation of the concepts that I use when I teach, and some leglock specific concepts. And then we get into updating the classics. So we go over, the standard Ashy, the inside Ashy, the 411 saddle, cross Ashy kind of positions. And we just, review what they look like, how they're more played nowadays. We go over some of the newer entries. We go over updated breaking or finishing mechanics. And then we start to get into the more, newfangled positions. Although newfangled is funny because, the 50-50 has made a huge return to leg locking. So, for a little while, 50-50 was considered passé, and the 50-50 has made a huge comeback. It played differently than it was before. Certainly back in the day, the 50-50 was just two guys sitting on their butts trying to do, trying to expose each other's heels, much more of a shootout type of game. Whereas now we're basically looking at it from the perspective of a top player and a bottom player, and we're advocating not, having both guys sitting on their butts. And then there's the outside Senkaku position, 80-20, 90-10, that kind of stuff that Lachlan Giles has really, popularized, repopularized, largely out of the K-guard. So that was probably the first big kind of change. That was the first putting the world on notice kind of moment, where a couple of 80cc's ago, where Lachlan went out there and got bronze in the absolute division and showed that you could heel hook in a very different way than was currently being played. So like the Danaher, Cummings, whatever you want to call it, system was pretty much, untouched as the method of leg locking for about 4 or 5 years. And then Lachlan came about with his stuff. And then you've got, after the updating the classics, we go into both the 50-50 and the outside Senkaku position. And I think before that, we get into the inside Ashy and the Zedlock. So these are, again, not positions that were really, certainly the inside Ashy wasn't really all that favored before. It's certainly gotten a lot more attention for various reasons. Again, like one of the things with leg locking, and I shouldn't say with leg locking, with just jiu-jitsu in general, is that positions that fall out of favor because people are quite good at defending them, when they fall out of favor, people stop being good at defending them. And so they can come back into favor. And it's really quite difficult to be at the top of the game at defending everything. And so because the, saddle, inside Senkaku, 411, whatever you want to call it, became the main meta attack, like everybody wanted to get there because it was considered the strongest position. Everybody got very good at defending it. And so now you've got these other positions that, although you could argue for various reasons, maybe you're not as strong in some ways as the 411, they can be more useful because most of the competitors you're going to face are not going to be as proficient at defending those. So the inside Ashy is certainly one of them. The Zedlock, which is, I still think, a very robust position, but made much more so by the fact that a lot of people just haven't seen it and don't have a good answer for it. So because we've got some fairly new stuff that people just haven't been in for very long, the defenses are not that refined, they're not that obvious. So we go into that, and then we go into other kind of like cutting edge leg lock meta, which is countering leg locks with back takes. And we will go through both like fundamentally what the counter back takes to leg lock positions look like, but more so because this is a leg lock instructional and we want you to be confident in your leg locking. We just show how to defend and counter the typical back takes that you'll see out of the leg lock positions. And then we go over how to actually re-attack the legs, having defended or countered those back takes. So we go through all that. And then the conclusion of the instructional is what we call leg spaghetti, which is, if you've heard of Fuck Your Jiu-Jitsu, it's Fuck Your Jiu-Jitsu for developing leg entanglements and leg lock defense and finishes and sparring the position in a way that allows for like maximum development in the minimum amount of time.
Got it. Now, what would you say is philosophically and conceptually, the main differences between, I guess, the old modern leg lock game and the new postmodern leg lock game? I mean, you talked about some of the positional differences, but are there any overarching themes that you've identified as being a significant deviation from what people might have been used to before?
Well, the main one would just be what we would call the reverse pathway or the reverse flow. So the established methodology for leg locking or the orthodoxy for leg locking for about 5 years prior to a couple of years ago was that you established a position first, right? Like you looked to gain control of the hip, control of the knee, and then start digging, creating heel exposure. So you would get to a strong leg entanglement. Ideally, you would get control of both legs, what most people know as double trouble. And then while maintaining that control and maintaining good hip isolation, making sure somebody's broken down to a hip and having a difficult time disentangling, you would go through a process of digging out the heel. And in that process, you would often find a lot of success. And then as people got better at defending it, you would find that once you let go of the secondary leg, people would then be able to start effecting some form of defense, whether it's just trying to extract themselves from the position, or in the more sophisticated, more confident practitioners, you would see people trying to create counter back takes or counter leg locks. So that was kind of how things were done. The reverse pathway involves now gaining a heel exposure. And this is, again, what you saw Lachlan do so well at ADCC a few iterations back, is you saw gaining heel exposure, maintaining it through a position that we refer to as the ankle clamp. in our instructional. So you have an inside ankle clamp and an outside ankle clamp. And once you gain that control at the ankle and gain the heel exposure, then you work your way back towards the hip control. So, conceptually, a good leg lock is going to fulfill the requirements of hip control, knee control, and lever control. It's just prior to the most recent revolution in leg locks, you started with hip control and knee control and worked your way down to the end of the lever. Now you can start at the end of the lever and work your way back towards the hip control, having gained the heel exposure. So that basically completely turned the orthodoxy on its head, literally reversed it. So you can swing both ways now, which I think is a really great free place to be as a human being.
Yeah, that is kind of an interesting variation. Now, do you think, Rob, that this in any way contradicts or conflicts with the kind of like old adage of position over submission? Or are you saying that people are basically just not engaging in positional control? Or are you saying that it's just a different type of positional control?
It's just a different type of positional control. So you're still utilizing a lever control where the person who, like when you start with an ankle clamp, and you gain heel exposure, it's not like your opponent, unless you're very bad at it, because obviously anything done badly can get you in trouble. But if you're doing it properly, then your opponent or your training partner, it's not like they have the ability to come in and sort of smash you and go after you. They have to respect the fact that you have heel exposure. So if you get the next control, you're going to start to get to a point where you might be able to break their leg, which means they've got to kind of disengage. So, all things being equal, obviously there are going to be exceptions to this. Like I said, if you're sloppy about it, if you're not creating a proper lever mechanic, you're not working your way towards control of the hip, direct control of the hip. Sorry. So, we've talked in some of our previous work about the idea of direct versus proxy control. So we are looking to control, like the ankle clamp. I am looking to control it as a position. I'm just doing that at the end of the lever. Right. So I'm trying to think of a good analogy for this.
It's maybe analogous to controlling your opponent with a kimura, right? If you just have a kimura and the person can freely move around, you're really going to have to rip that kimura to finish it. But if I'm using a kimura, and it's not like I've abandoned position, because that kimura in itself is a fairly strong positional control. I think that might be an analogy for the...
Yeah, and like probably another analogy that would help from the world of the gi is a spider guard, or lasso, where you've got from the outside, if you've never experienced it, might look like an incredibly flimsy amount of control. That single lever, that single sleeve, and the foot being bound up in the biceps doesn't look like much. And your first time experiencing it, somebody puts you in a lasso and you decide to run to the other side and you instantly get swept because it's such a powerful lever. So if you understand the lever mechanic, then the positional control is really sound. If you don't understand the lever mechanic and you are just falling back on a leg, then you're not being cognizant enough of that whole idea of positional control. So it definitely still works within the framework of controlling a position or viewing the submission as a position. It's just being done slightly differently. Like I said, the flow is just reversed. You start with the heel exposure, and then as your partner is attempting to flee, you are then gaining the control of the knee, you're gaining the control of the hip.
Got it. Yeah. Something that we've talked about before on the show is this idea of the 3-joint rule, where your arms and legs kind of have 3 major joints of control. And ultimately, if you want to submit someone, you probably need to be locking down and controlling all 3 of those. But I think what you've brought to light here is that the order of attack kind of varies depending on what you want to do. I mean, you can go from hip to knee to ankle, but alternately, it sounds like you're saying that the new way is to go from ankle to knee to hip. And at the end of the day, you're going to wind up in the same place. It's just a different strategy.
Yeah, and it's not the only new way. Certainly, if we want to talk about the Zedlock position, then you are very much gaining that really solid hip control, really solid wedges, still gaining like the double lever control, the double trouble, and controlling both legs, and then isolating a joint and attacking it. The big difference there being that you don't have to let go of the other leg. So, in the, the slightly older method of leg locking, we were always having to relinquish our control of the secondary leg to pursue a heel hook because we had to connect our hands. With the Z-lock, the luxury of the position is that, both your legs are safe. They're to the inside, and you've still got control of the secondary leg, and you're using one hand to pursue a hip lock / potentially knee lock. There's a knee bar in there that you can do, kind of like really just with your inner thigh, your Suzanne Summers muscles. So that's a very interesting derivation that, again, as far as I know, was actually also created by Eddie Cummings. So just goes to show you how much of a godfather of leg locking that dude is.
The Z-lock, which I find strange saying because I'm Canadian and so it should be Zedlock, but everyone calls it the Z-lock, so I'll give it a pass for now. It's funny because fundamentally it's the reap position. Fundamentally it's the game over, which was kind of the king of the hill back in the late 90s, early 2000s, right? That was what was passed on for the very few of us who were leg locking at the time as the best leg lock position you could get prior to the advent of the saddle, prior to the advent of the 411, which I think took the crown. So the Zedlock, I'm going to call it the Zedlock now, just because we talked about it, is essentially the reap while controlling the other leg and while being able to attack the reaping leg with just one arm and all the transitions and all the other submissions that come out of that position. So it's actually quite amusing to see this thing come back as such a dominant position 20 years after it was last super dominant. Everything old is new again, and that's just another example of that process happening.
Well, and even without the secondary leg control, I was going through a period a couple of years ago where I was finding it much easier to heel hook like good leg lockers from the inside Ashy, from essentially like the reap with a reinforced leg. Again, not because it's necessarily inherently mechanically superior, but just because everybody was so much better at defending the 411 or the saddle, but people had just neglected that initial, reaping inside Ashy position because people were just immediately trying to transfer over to the inside heel hook. So I found some decent success with that. So it really is a little bit of a everything old is new again, because even though the Z-lock position is new in the sense that it's that double lever control, that there's a huge difference between that and the game over position. The game over position is quite defendable for proficient leg lockers, whereas the Z-lock, you see people who are just they're just flummoxed by it. There isn't a simple defense that you can just use to leave the position because of the luxury afforded by, because of the overwhelming control afforded by maintaining control of the secondary leg while attacking the primary leg.
So let's talk about the Zedlock here, and I will call it the Zedlock because I'm a proud Canadian. So I want to talk about this for a second because for a lot of people, they might not really even understand what it is or what it looks like. I mean, as an example, Stephan, for a long time, I was really confused when I heard people talking about the resurgence of the Zedlock. And the reason why, and I don't know if you remember this, but a long time ago, like 10 years ago, I think you did a tutorial video with Eric Paulson where he showed a neck crank called the Zedlock. And I use it all the time because I'm an asshole. And I was very confused when people started talking about this and saying it's a leg lock. And then I realized, okay, this is actually just a completely different thing that people are discussing. But yeah, for those who haven't seen it, it is a very weird looking position. I mean, at first glance, it actually doesn't look very controlling at all because it doesn't look like what a lot of, I guess you would call textbook classic jiu-jitsu submissions look like. When you see someone doing a submission, normally what you're kind of expecting is them to kind of get their arms together and coil their whole body around a limb somewhere. But with the Zedlock, it's very weird, right? I mean, you're like you said, Rob, you're doing double trouble control, which makes it very hard to escape a position like that when you've got two levers instead of one. But you're almost kind of like using one hand to sort of like punch the leg into a submission. I'm not the best at describing this because I'm far from an expert in it. But Rob, Stephan, maybe could you guys quickly explain to people like what we mean by the Zedlock and why it's so different from traditional leg locks?
Go for it, Rob.
Yeah, so as we've kind of touched on so far, it starts from the reaping position. So if you picture yourself being in a standard Ashy or a single leg X with both players seated on their butt, and you would then take, so if I'm entangling my opponent's left leg, I've got my left leg in between their legs, I've got my right leg kind of wrapped around on top of their hip. I would continue to wrap my right leg around their thigh until my right foot was all the way in between their legs. This is what you would call a reap. And by doing that, I'm going to internally rotate my partner's hip, and their knee is going to start to kind of point in towards their other leg. And then I'm going to sort of half triangle my leg. So I don't want to fully triangle my leg where my ankle is behind my knee, because the gap will be too large, and my partner, unless they've got the mountain type quads, they're going to be able to extract their leg. So I want to sort of half triangle with, in this case, my left calf kind of around my right ankle. And now I've created the inside Ashy position. So I've got a reinforced wedge or a clamp around my partner's left leg, and then I need to reach over and in some fashion grab their right ankle and pull it to me, so that both of their legs kind of end up in between my knees. And I'll be taking an overhook ankle lock style grip on my partner's right leg. So now basically both of my partner's legs are kind of bound together, with their left leg in particular being slightly internally rotated. And then I'll be reaching through with my left arm and grabbing my right shin to add some extra reinforcement to that wedge. So at this point, it should be, nigh unto impossible for somebody to just extract, because of the combination of the strength of the wedges and the internal rotation of my partner's leg. And while I've got that position, controlled or established, I should then be able to use my right arm, because it's essentially, it's free, it's unencumbered. And I will use that arm to reach under my partner's left foot. So I will turn my palm up and grab under kind of the bunion or the big toe, and start basically forcing my training partner's hip into extreme internal rotation, and start pushing my partner's the outside edge of their left foot up towards the sky. Their legs should be at roughly a 90-degree angle at this point. And because of the wedges that are around my partner's knee, they're kind of stuck in place now. Because I'm controlling their other leg, they can't turn one way or the other, so they're stuck as I continue to push their foot up. This usually creates either damage at the knee, or it becomes a really strong hip lock for some people. So that's basically what the Z-lock is. And if you have very flexible hips, there's a pretty significant degree to which you can eat this. I'm one of the people that has, I'm not very flexible in a lot of ways. I certainly don't have external hip rotation the way that a lot of high-level jiu-jitsu practitioners do. I can't do the lotus position or anything like that. But, being Canadian, I used to play hockey and I was a goalie, and I could do the butterfly position, which is very different in hockey than it is in jiu-jitsu.
Yeah.
The butterfly position in hockey is basically the exact opposite of what it is in jiu-jitsu, where, in jiu-jitsu, it's complete external rotation of the hips if you're sitting in the butterfly stretch. In hockey, it's complete internal rotation of the hips. So your knees are essentially together and your feet are splayed out at your side. So I can pretty much sit with my knees on the ground, my feet on the ground, my butt on the ground, and I can lean back and my shoulders will touch the ground. So to get me into a position where I feel anything in my hips is extraordinarily difficult. But the great thing about the Z-lock is it's a freebie. There's essentially no risk. If it doesn't work, you've got such incredible control of the other person that there's nothing they can really do about it. So you get to test their flexibility out. And if they tap, great. If not, they're no threat to you. And you can still attempt to pursue other submissions. You can transfer it back over into the saddle. You can pursue leg locks on the other leg. So it's a really, outstanding position.
And it's really weird to look at, too, because like you said, you're kind of punching and forcing the person's leg into that weird 90-degree angle. It doesn't look like a lot of other jiu-jitsu submissions where you're kind of, grabbing their limb and trying to coil your body onto or around it. With this one, it's like you're almost like you're punching or uppercutting the leg away. It's very strange looking. I mean, if you haven't seen it before and you see it for the first time, you might not even realize it's actually a submission. It looks so weird.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a video that's, sort of made the rounds not too long ago of a guy at B Team getting his leg pretty badly wrecked by a young lady.
Wasn't that Ethan Krellenstein's brother?
It may be, yeah. And it was just one of those where like she just threw him into the position and started a little bit of the pressure. And I don't think she didn't get a chance to go for the Z-lock to any like significant degree. It's just the internal rotation on the knee. As soon as she kind of like grabbed his foot, the guy just like his ACL just detonated. And it's not like she was pushing the leg way up or anything. I think he was just resisting the reaping force a little too much. So it's definitely one of those positions that can feel sort of innocuous. This is nothing new. Like one of the rationales behind banning, reaping for the longest time was, people who aren't familiar with the position will hurt themselves. And I mean, I think Cub Swanson basically blew out his own ACL by fighting a reap in a quintet or some kind of similar event not too long ago. So you got guys who are, very, very experienced grapplers and MMA fighters, but not overly experienced leg lockers who will just try to like stiff leg or like put on the boot as a response to the reap and essentially will blow their own knee out. And so that is kind of the risk that's happening with the Z-lock. It's an extreme example of if you do the wrong thing here, it's not like the person doing the submission really is the one that injured you. It's you injured yourself by fighting it wrong.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So something that we've discussed here on the show before is the differences between trying to control one lever at a time versus two levers at a time. I guess a common and obvious example is if I'm going to guillotine you, if I do it just with your head, odds are it's probably going to be a little bit more powerful, but it also lacks a bit of the control that you might get if you go for something like an arm in guillotine or an arm triangle. And just generally, this was a big realization to me, understanding that if you're attacking one thing at a time, you might get more power, but at the cost of more control. And I know this is one of the criticisms, I guess, of the classic leg lock game, particularly the classic straight ankle lock, right? Gets a bad rap because when you're just tying your body around one leg and there's no twist, it's relatively easy for your opponent to build base, to get up on their foot, to rotate, to spin. And a problem...
UFC number 1.
Yeah, exactly.
Ken Shamrock versus Hoist Gracie.
Yeah. And so the problem with that kind of classic approach is until you control a second lever, your opponent does have an escape option. Same thing even with classic jiu-jitsu. I mean, when you're doing an arm bar from the top, a common rookie mistake is you're grabbing and you're pulling that arm and you're putting all of your power and focus on the near side arm that you're attacking. But wedging the far side arm is actually super important because that's how you prevent your opponent from rotating out and hitchhikering. And I remember this being a big realization to me, which is that second lever gives you a ton of control. With that said, Rob and Stephan, do you think that this new innovation here renders some of the old stuff obsolete, or do you think there's still a place for both approaches?
No, I don't think it does. I think there have been some updates, right? Like even, to reference the straight ankle lock, like the straight ankle lock really up until a couple of years ago was kind of like, it was almost a dead submission at the high level. Like nobody was going to tap to a straight ankle lock. And if you review the last couple of gi worlds, no gi, like there's a guy named Mateusz Szczecinski, a Polish grappler who just has a incredibly vicious straight ankle lock. Mikey Musumeci won gi worlds in like lightning fashion with a straight ankle lock. There have been quite a few developments in updating both the control schemes and the finishing mechanics on the straight ankle lock. So certainly the old, let's say positions or submissions are far from obsolete. Just there's been an evolution in how they're applied. So like we do go over that in the instructional, like the ankle lock from Butterfly Ashy and that kind of stuff. So there's definitely a lot of merit to the older positions. It's just you're having to adjust how you apply it. The Aoki lock is another example of that, where relatively new submission, and back in the day 3, 4, 5 years ago, it wasn't thought of as being particularly viable to attempt to finish the secondary leg. You were controlling with the secondary leg so that you could attack the primary leg and you would finish on the primary leg. Now you can actually finish on the secondary leg using something like an Aoki lock. There are versions of the ankle lock that you can do on the secondary leg. Sometimes there are toe holds, things like that. So now that idea of double lever control is even more valid. And then, there are developments in positions that we call, the nomenclature that we use is the 45 and the 54, which are, I think some of the guys out there call it the X legs Ashy, where you're crossing your ankles over on the secondary leg or the secondary hip to some degree to eliminate the possibility of rotation. So like both the idea of maintaining some sort of control of the other leg while you attempt to finish on one leg, the idea of maintaining control of the primary leg while you try to finish on the secondary leg, and the idea of just attacking one leg and maintaining lever control over one leg, provided your mechanics are robust enough to negate the ability to rotate away or to at least compensate for it. All of those approaches are valid. We were just, it's a brave new world, right? Like a lot of developments are occurring in very much real time. And if you stay up on them, you kind of can, you just be an incredibly diverse leg locker who can threaten and finish people from so many more places than was possible a few years ago.
I think one other thing that initially we talked about, sort of the previous generation of leg lockers, for the most part, when those guys were competing, they were the leg lock sharks and everyone else was a leg lock goldfish. It was rare to have two really good leg lockers saying, okay, bring it, go ahead, attack me. And I know how to counter this. And I'm going to, I'd like have two people sort of in the leg lock pocket, each trying to finish the other guy with leg locks. This is much more common now. And the knowledge of escapes and counters is much higher. So then a lot of the new stuff is based around having to counter your opponent's counter and counter your opponent's escape attempts and be able to, when they slip their knee out of your entanglement, what do you do now? Do you re-entangle them? Do you go to their back? Do you go to the top? Do you pass the guard? And it's just the competitive landscape is changing. It's not only that new techniques are evolving, but also the level of resistance that is being encountered is higher. That's a big change as well that we could have mentioned earlier and just forgot to mention.
Well, this is something, Rob, that you did bring up. You were talking about how a lot of the more modern or postmodern leg lock positions are kind of more defensible because you haven't committed as many vulnerabilities as maybe in some other positions. And I mean, that's been a criticism of the old modern leg lock game. I know, Rob, I've heard you describe it as leg lock or bust, where, basically people will do anything they can to get into a leg entanglement and they'll roll the dice on it. And they're either going to live by the sword or die by the sword, depending. And that's been something that for me has always been a turnoff of kind of that old leg lock game.
I think we need to specify here, Steve, or at least in my opinion, is that that's the generation before this one, mostly. That's what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah,
like we're talking early 2000s-ish, when people mostly went for leg locks from the top. The bottom leg lock entry game wasn't developed as nearly as much. And, the extent of the leg lock attacks from the bottom was basically pulling single leg X.
Mm-hmm. I would say, though, that even in a more modern scenario, it really did feel like for a long time there wasn't much interest in classical jiu-jitsu. Especially in Nogi had moved to an almost entire focus on leg entanglements and control. And, in a lot of those positions, it will just come down to who's the better leg locker. So the idea of new positions where you're not as committed to risk, where you can attack your opponent with these attacks, but it's harder for them to get at you, that's always something that I think is appealing in any jiu-jitsu scenario, right? I think any time that you can get into a situation where you can launch good attacks, but you haven't committed yourself to much risk, that's always going to be a win.
Yeah, agreed. And I do think for a little while there was a kind of a, I don't want to say a fad but there was a period of development where I think the first thing that you saw change about the more modern style of leg locking is the outside Ashy positions fell out of favor. Because for a period of time, again, probably around 2015 to 2017, 2018, maybe, if you had the new stuff, you could literally, if you just entangled the legs somehow, you would get to a control position that you could finish from, and that included outside Ashy. And then over time, the limitations of that position and the exposure of that position to counter back takes started to become, and not just counter back takes, but top pressure and passing became, at least revealed. And so you went through this phase where if you were somebody who was just trying to dive on the legs and one of your, leg lock or bust approaches was just to get the hell to outside Ashy, for a while you could totally get away with it and you'd heel hook a lot of people. And then for a while you couldn't. You would just get your back taken. And there are things that you can do nowadays to, make sure that you try to stay a little bit safer in outside Ashy. And, people are, it's swinging back around to where some people feel confident playing it. But I'd say that was probably the first, let's say, victim or the first casualty of the more modern leg locking system is the outside Ashy position, because it was the position that had the least robust control, at least the way a lot of people played it. It fell victim to the more classic, positional control of jiu-jitsu, where if you didn't have redundant frames, if you didn't have multiple lever control, then you were going to be vulnerable to being counterattacked by people who were, brave or confident or skillful enough to stay in the pocket with you.
Stephan, what are your thoughts on the long-term evolution of the leg lock game? Because you might have been making leg lock instructionals since before anybody. Since the VHS days. So you've kind of seen the whole thing from, I don't know if you could say the beginning, but from very early on up until now. What are your thoughts on the long-term evolution of this and what's changed? And just tell me, what's in your mind when you see all of these new developments?
Well, it's super interesting. I kind of see it. Right now, I'm using a schema where I'm dividing it into sort of 4 ages, right? There's the historical age, which I guess sort of starts in
the Bronze Age of leg locks,
medieval Japan, and centaurs leg locking Greek hoplites on some wall, up to an era that includes Helio Gracie. I think there's that famous picture of him doing a standing figure 4 ankle lock against an opponent who's down on the ground with absolutely zero positional control, like he's about to turn him over into a Boston Crab, which I'm going to go out here and make a bold prediction. The Boston Crab will be the next evolution of leg locks in faith.
The Boston Crab is legit. I will not hear anyone slander the mighty Boston Crab. It's an incredible submission.
No, it has severely injured a bunch of people in real competitions. Yeah. So, but then there was kind of the early era of leg locks, which was exemplified, I think, by people like Eric Paulson, maybe Dean Lister, and then the whole army of guys fighting out of Shuto in Japan. This is the era when it was the ultimate leg lock or bust era. So this is in the late 90s. You'd have some Brazilian champion facing off against some Japanese champion, and these fights would only end in one of 2 ways. Either the Japanese guy would shoot for a leg, and it would either break the Brazilian guy's leg, or he would blow the position and the Brazilian guy would climb on the back of the Japanese fighter and choke him out. That was the only 2 ways those fights went. And that was kind of the second era of, where people like Oleg Taktarov, where there was a little bit of knowledge coming in from Sambo and a little bit of knowledge coming in through Japan, which was, ultimately related to Sambo because Sambo was a big influence in the early shoot wrestling. But it was very rare to have 2 people competent at leg locks going at each other. Then that eventually morphed into the third age, where the idea of positional control became really important. And this is the era of Eddie Cummins and the EBI competition, and to some extent Abu Dhabi, and no gi competition. I'm not sure it's more popular than gi competition, but it's certainly on par with. And the people started training leg locks at a younger age, right? It was no longer, we're going to save leg locks for when you're a brown belt in our until you're a brown rash guard. You might be able to start training leg locks when you were a white rash guard or a blue rash guard. And now we're, like I said, and like we've been talking about, there have been a number of additional evolutions. It's really quite common to have people with very high levels of leg lock familiarity going at it and both staying in the pocket. And for example, Rob, you competed a couple days ago and there was a 50-50 battle, which you won.
Yeah, literally a couple days ago, 2 days ago. Yeah, I had a match. I had a couple of matches at the Grappling Industries, and one of them became a leg entanglement battle, which I initiated. So just to give you an idea of how elaborate these things get, I initiated the leg entanglement battle by creating a I don't want to say a fake sweep threat, but like it was certainly a sweep that I had no intention of finishing, but I wanted to get my partner to post their foot while being inside of my half guard so that I could pummel my leg to the outside and attempt a Kyotera ankle lock in a fashion that I don't think most people have seen. I think everybody who competes against me now knows that if you stand, I will try to Kyo ankle lock you. So I don't get too many standing, like people trying to pass my guard standing anymore. So I've come up with a couple of creative ways to try to get people to post their feet so that I can at least get to that as a threat. And rather than, worrying all that much about me trying to Kyo ankle lock him, my opponent just entangled my other leg. So I was trying to go to my right side on his left leg, and he just went ahead and grabbed my left leg and tried to get into a leg entanglement, which he fell to his back to attempt, which I used to get on top. And then he put my leg into 50-50, which is a position that I'm quite comfortable with. And I managed to use actually basically, pretty much exactly some of the stuff that you're going to see in the 50-50, I wanted to say module, but the 50-50 volume of this instructional to, one, get on top, two, stay on top safely, play it as a top position, three, create control that negated my opponent's ability to successfully dig out a heel. So I used something that we refer to as the skating stride to keep my heel hidden. And because my opponent was confident in his ability to try to go after my leg, he afforded me the opportunity to go after his. And I managed to catch a counter heel hook from the top 50-50 position, which I was able to finish the match with.
Nice. Now, let me ask a question here for both of you. Where do you see the future of the leg lock game evolving? Is it too early to say, or are we going to predict that people are going to be like leg locking each other in flying cars with ChatGPT and all of this stuff? I'd be very curious to know if we have an idea as to where this thing's going to be going.
Well, I mean, I think that's a pretty difficult thing to predict. I think right now, like we're already seeing a lot more of the, leg locks versus, berimbolo style back takes. And I think that's something that is largely because of, as Stephan mentioned, like the IBJJF legalizing heel hooks basically means that you've got a bunch of guys who are going after legs, having matches against a bunch of guys who are really good at taking the back from the bolo position. And essentially, those are both leg entanglements. Like the berimbolo and the various leg positions are just ways of manipulating the legs as levers. They're slightly different, but they're still just leg entanglements, essentially. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that battle continues to play out and what comes out of that. I think right now, to some degree, I think the back takers might be a little bit ahead of the game. And I think that, there's going to be a bit of a seesaw battle there. So I think that's one of the areas where a lot of development has yet to occur. Much like, the first generation of berimbolo, like the 1.0 berimbolo, is a pretty archaic mechanism now. Like nobody just berimbolos somebody in that old school way anymore. There are so many transitions that have to occur. There are updated berimbolo mechanics, and there's the crab ride, there's coming up into the mount or the leg drag, and there's all that kind of stuff that's going on. So I think that we're still in kind of the first iteration of berimbolo versus leg entanglement. And so I think we're going to get, version 2.0, version 3.0, version 4.0 of that. That I would say is almost a given based on the nature, like the sort of mutual opportunity nature of those positions. I definitely think that, some positions are just going to cycle in and out of favor. So I think that I'm going to go out on a bit of a limb here and say that the false reap is going to get solved because I don't think it's as mechanically sound a position as some of the other ones. So I'm really interested to see how people are going to go about, again, like it, when I say it's going to get solved, someone's going to solve it and then somebody who plays it is going to figure out a way to deal with that solution. So I think that the false reap is probably the position that's going to develop dramatically over the next couple of years, because again, we're in the infancy of it, much like we were in the infancy of the saddle early on, where if you just knew a good entry into the saddle, you could just finish people in like 30 seconds. That's a little bit of what's happening with the false reap right now. So if you're just good at the false reap and you're flexible and can invert well, you can pretty much just go there and take people out. There isn't a lot of, like, the battles in the false reap are not very deep. You either come up with the obvious solution, which we address in the instructional, and you just shut it down, or you don't. So I do think that position is going to get solved, and therefore there's going to have to be another iteration and another iteration. So I still think we're in the sort of first phase of these new positions, like the false reap, like the Zedlock, and I think those positions are going to get solved, and then there will be follow-ups to that. So I don't think we're going to see a completely new leg locking position come about like in the immediate future, just because I think first those couple of newer positions have to get solved, and then answers for those solutions have to come about. And then after that happens, I think is when we will see, an entirely new position or a modification of an existing position. Who knows? Maybe calf slicers are going to become a huge thing, and that's going to be something that comes back around. But that's about as far out as I'm willing to predict, is that this wave is going to go, a couple of iterations.
I'm going to go with the prediction of, or the saying of famous leg locker Niels Bohr, who was the physicist, whose quote is, "Prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future."
Future, yeah.
Yeah, most people don't know that Niels Bohr was a famous leg locker, actually. I'm glad you brought that up, Stephan.
Yeah, it's little known fact. Come to me for more fascinating science facts. I'm going to have a prediction that there will be crazy things that seem crazy to us coming down the pipe. Rob may be right that first these other positions need to be solved, but when I think back to my early exposure to leg locks, and I think of some of the crazy ass Sambo stuff that was coming out of Russia, and that I'd be watching these VHS tapes in Russian of these high-level leg lockers doing crazy and seemingly impossible things to each other. Impossible in the sense that, like, they wouldn't work against somebody who was conscious and had a pulse. But there must be ways into that. And there's the advantage of getting into a position that the other person doesn't understand is so high. And I don't think we've yet come to the limits of human creativity of how we can entwine somebody's legs with our own legs.
So we're talking about the Boston Crab again, aren't we? You think the Boston Crab's going to be the next big thing?
I go back to, there was a dude competing out of Saskatchewan years ago. I want to say 15 years ago, who went and competed in Brazil. Have you ever seen this footage? And he went for he stood up in the guy's closed guard, and he went for the full Boston Crab, and he kind of stepped halfway over, and then they collapsed sideways. So the guy's spine didn't end up getting bent backwards. It ended up getting bent sideways, and there was just this awful screaming and crunching sound, and the guy ended up getting carried off the mats, and I assume was pretty severely injured. It was like a Boston Crab gone wrong. So I have great respect for it. I also, the few times I've caught it in my grappling career, it's been bragging rights for life. And I just regret that this was before the era where video cameras and phones and photography was so widespread, because that would be a framed photo on my wall. So I don't know if it's a Boston Crab or some weird Russian thing or something out of, and if any of your listeners are really old school, they'll remember Hidetake Aso and Submission Arts Wrestling. Rob, you probably remember that. And the whole bunch of crazy ass leg entanglements that, again, looked like the other person needed to be in a coma to get. There are probably ways into those crazy leg entanglements that you can get to deliberately that would give you a humongous advantage once you got there. So I'm looking out.
Well, I think the main thing that we've got to kind of realize here is that it's just a matter of time, right? Like the numbers in terms of the amount of brains and bodies that are being thrown at a problem are going to determine how long, of a time scale we're looking at before a problem gets solved, or before a new problem gets created and then that problem gets solved. And because for, let's say the recent history of grappling, as you mentioned, very few people were actually working on solving any, leg lock related problems. And so the solutions were unsophisticated. If you even look at, think about how, in most people's estimation, up until quite recently, Sambo was the leg locking art, right? Like if you wanted to learn leg locks, that's where you went. You went to Sambo. And now I think it's, probably not insulting anybody to say that Sambo is quite secondary to jiu-jitsu in terms of the effectiveness of leg locking, right? Like when jiu-jitsu people go up against Sambo people, Sambo people get their legs broken nowadays, right? Like if you look at the recent match between Mikey Musumeci and that poor dumb bastard who let every single iota of his leg get shredded in a match and refused to tap. If you look at, Craig Jones and in quintet going up against guys who basically just are eating leg breaks and not able to threaten him in any way. Like the state of leg locking in jiu-jitsu is much higher than it is in Sambo. And it's just because more people are doing it, right? Like there are so many more practitioners playing with it, and the level of competition is so much higher. The skill level of a Sambo world champion versus an 80cc world champion, the gulf is enormous because it's just a much wider talent pool you're drawing from. And so as the no-gi talent pool gets greater and greater, I still think that right now in the world of jiu-jitsu, the gi talent pool is bigger. And so you've seen the arms race in gi jiu-jitsu that's been going on, probably for about 20 years now. And it has resulted in this incredible explosion of development and all these different techniques that, to some degree didn't exist before. I think you're going to see that same thing in no-gi jiu-jitsu just because so many more people are working on the problem. And so, whatever is coming down the pike or the pipe or whatever, it's just a matter of time before it occurs because more and more people are investing their time and energy into the problem.
You know what I'm excited about is to see if there's going to be evolutions of using the gi to do more effective leg locks. I mean, so much of modern leg lock development took place in no-gi just due to the way that the rule set shook out. And I would be very curious to know, now that this is IBJJF approved.
Well, but it's not in the gi though. It's just in no-gi that you have adult brown and black belts are able to now do heel hooks and reaping and all that.
I would argue we've seen a little bit of cross-pollination from gi to no-gi, because something like the butterfly Ashy is an example of people in the gi trying to solve the problem of how to ankle lock somebody effectively without getting disqualified for reaping.
Right.
And I mean, so, okay, well, if instead of reaping to the inside, it's a wrong use of the term, but I'll reap to the outside and I'll use my butterfly hook here to control his leg. And now we're seeing that being re-imported into no-gi grappling, because it turns out that butterfly hook and your shin across the back of his knee is a pretty good way to break the structure of his leg and make it harder for the guy to put the boot on. And so a little bit of that has already happened. But
yeah, you're going to get that kind of hyper specialization that comes from restrictive rule sets, much like with the rules in judo as they got more and more hyper specialized, right? Like you couldn't touch the legs, and now you can't make certain grips, and now you can't break grips in certain ways and all that. So you're going to have development that happens from that. But I don't think that's the best kind of development. I think the best kind of development is what you're seeing with like the totally open rule sets, where it's just do whatever the hell you want, and let's figure out the absolute best solution for the problem without putting an artificial barrier in the way.
Here's my prediction for the future. IBJJF legalizes leg locks in the gi, all leg locks effectively, and we start to see some really crazy stuff happen. I am looking forward to see people get their legs hog-tied together, like, those oldie movies where someone gets tied up on the train tracks. I'm looking forward to seeing some really crazy lapel-based leg submissions. So I do think that that's probably going to happen at some point, and once it does, I'm interested to see if the leg lock game is going to evolve and change with the gi now being a factor.
Allow people to take their belts off, tie them into lariats, and have like an ancient gladiator thing where you've got some dude with a lariat fighting some guy who doesn't have a lariat. So.
Well, apropos of gi leg locks, I think to this day for me, still one of the most spectacular leg lock entrances, finishes ever was Braulio Estima at, I think it was 2013 or maybe 2014 Gi Worlds, where he used a spider guard, like a spinning spider guard entry into a knee bar. So I would be very, very down for seeing what some of the gi guys can come up with as far as leg lock entries if they removed some of the restrictions.
Right. Well, hey guys, we've been going for about an hour now. Before we tie this up, any closing thoughts? Anything you wanted to add about postmodern leg locks that we didn't discuss yet?
Yes, I've got something to add. Anyone looking for this should not be looking for postmodern leg locks. They should be looking for cutting edge leg locks, which is the name of the damn instructional. It's too late to change it now. So damn you. I'm going to have to create some kind of disambiguation page for postmodern leg lock formula.
I am going to create so much brand confusion around this instructional that you are going to have to rename it, Stephan. That is my new goal.
Yeah, let's please insert something at the beginning that says this is called cutting edge leg locks.
Yeah, well, what I'll do, as I always do, is I'll put the full name and the link in the show notes. So if anyone wants to pick this up, yeah, I'll put the link there. You can just tap it one click, or alternately, just go to the Grapplearts page or search for cutting edge leg locks, and you should be able to find it. Stephan, Rob, any additional plugs beyond that, or things that people should know about this instructional?
I mean, it's awesome.
Well, definitely.
Additional plugs. I always try to mention my visiting student program. If anybody is interested in coming and training with me at my gym in Nanaimo, BC, Canada, hit me up through some social media or some website, or like send a telex or something.
Carrier pigeon.
Send Rob a fax.
Yeah, and get in touch with me, and we'll find a way to get you over here. You can take a steamship, or maybe get on a stagecoach or something and make your way to Nanaimo, and I will host you for free for 1 week at my home, and you can train for free for 1 week at my academy, and I can show you some of this cutting edge leg lock material that we've been talking about.
Nice. Stephan, how about you, man?
I have nothing to offer that's quite as generous as Rob. They want to check out my site, it's grapplearts.com, and if they want to grab my main app, it's the Grapplearts BJJ Master app, which has got a whole ton of free content on it, so they can check out all my instructionals, including this latest joint instructional, Cutting Edge Leg Locks. What's that? That's Cutting Edge Leg Locks, where they can preview a whole bunch of the material for free. So if they look for the Grapplearts BJJ Master app.
Awesome. Amazing. So as I always do, I'll put the links in the show notes. I'll also put a link to our stuff. BJJMentalModels.com is where everything lives. So if you want over 200 episodes of this stuff, or our awesome database of concepts, or to get on our newsletter, that's where you go to do it. There will be, again, a link in the show notes, but in case you miss it, BJJMentalModels.com. That's also where you go to sign up for our awesome premium service. We got a ton of amazing coaches on there. I just got a bunch of reviews done by Brianna St. Marie. So really awesome service. Definitely recommend, if you want to have high-level black belts review your footage and give you direct coaching that you might not otherwise be able to get, hit up bjjmentalmodels.com and check out premium for a free trial. So thanks a lot, everyone. And of course, Stephan, Rob, thanks a lot for coming by and talking about the new cutting edge leg locks instructional. Again, one more time, that is cutting edge leg locks instructional. Really appreciate it, and always love chatting with you too.
Thanks so much, Steve.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, guys. All right, we'll wrap this one now. Thanks a lot, and thanks to the listeners as well. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.